There are three sounds a man learns to fear when he lives alone on 100 acres of nothing. The wind when it stops, the dog when it goes quiet, and a knock in the dark that comes soft, low down on the door, too low for a grown man's fist. That last one I heard on the coldest night of my 49th winter, and I will tell you now, before I tell you anything else, that I almost didn't open the door. I want you to sit with that, because whatever you think you'd have done, the brave thing, the good thing, I promise you the truth is smaller and colder than that. I stood in my own kitchen with my hand on the bolt and my heart going like a hammered fence post, and every reason I had told me to stay shut. It was the year they'd found 2 families burned out south of the Wash. It was the year the word Apache got spoken in town the way you'd speak of weather that kills. And it was 3 years, near to the day, since I'd buried the last 2 people I ever loved out under the cottonwood, and I hadn't opened my heart to a living soul since. So no, I wasn't brave. But the knock came again, and then a voice came through the wood, small, cracked, using English it had clearly been made to practice, and it said 4 words that unmade every wall I'd spent 3 years building. Mr. Mama needs help. This is the story of what I did after that. Some of it I'm proud of. Some of it I'd give a year of my life to undo. All of it is true, or true enough, which out here is the same thing. Stay with me to the end, because the boy at my door that night changed more than one life, and the last thing he ever said to me is the reason I'm telling any of this at all. The knock came a 3rd time before I moved. I remember I was counting. I count when I'm frightened, always have, some habit off my mother, God rest her, who used to count stitches out loud through the worst of the fevers. 1, 2, 3. I'd gotten to 11 when I finally slid the bolt, and I hated that it took me 11. Cold rolled in first, then the boy. He was maybe 8, maybe 9, hard to say, because he was the kind of thin that steals years off a child. He had a man's blanket wrapped around him twice and still trailing in the frost, and his feet were wrapped in rags gone black at the toes, and his face, Lord, his face. It wasn't crying, that's what got me. A crying child you know what to do with. This one wasn't crying, he was past it. He looked up at me with 2 flat dark eyes that had already decided I was going to say no, and he said it again, careful, like he'd been made to memorize it, and was afraid of getting a word wrong. Mama needs help. Behind him the night was enormous and black, and there was nothing in it but wind and the far-off complaint of my dog, who had not barked, which I noted and did not like. "Where's your mama?" I said. My voice came out rougher than I meant. He flinched at it, and I hated that too. He turned and pointed with his whole arm out past the corral, toward the low ground where the arroyo cut through my land like a scar. "Water," he said. Then he shook his head, frustrated with himself, hunting the word. "Down in the down." The wash, she was in the wash. Now here is where I have to be honest with you, the way I promised. Because in that moment I thought a great many things at once, and not all of them were good. I thought, this is a trick, boys get sent ahead, there are men waiting in the dark. I thought, if I take these 2 in and Cutter or any of the Bardi crowd rides by and sees them, I am a marked man in this county. I thought about the Holly's place, burned. I thought about my rifle by the door, and how a wise man keeps his own fences, and does not go walking into a black arroyo at midnight on the word of a strange child. And then I thought about Ruth. My wife had a way of looking at me when I was being small. She never said much. She'd just go still and look, and it was worse than any sermon, because Ruth loved me, and her disappointment was the disappointment of someone who'd expected better and been right too. She'd been gone 3 years, and I could feel her looking at me right then, plain as if she stood at the stove. "Wait here," I said to the boy. "By the fire, you understand? Fire, warm." He didn't move toward it. He watched me pull my coat off the peg and take the lantern and the rifle both, and when I moved for the door, he moved with me, and I understood that there was no leaving him behind. Wherever his mama was, he was going back to her, with me or without me. So I stopped arguing, and we went out together into the killing cold, an old white rancher and a half-froze Apache boy, and if you'd told me that morning that's how the night would find me, I'd have laughed at you. The walk to the wash is a 1/4 mile. It took us near to 20 minutes because the boy was spent. He'd already made that walk once tonight in the dark to reach my door, and I did not let myself think too long about a child crossing that country alone in the cold, or I'd have had to stop and sit down. Halfway there he stumbled, and I caught him by the back of the blanket, and he went rigid under my hand like a wild thing, and I let go quick. "Easy," I said. "Easy, I'm not easy." I started humming. I don't know why. It's a thing I do, another one of my fool habits. I hum when I don't know what to say, and it always comes out a hymn because those are the only tunes my hands know. Shall we gather at the river, off-key as a busted gate? The boy looked at me sideways like I'd lost my mind, and maybe that helped because a crazy man is less frightening than a hard one. He let me keep a hand near his shoulder after that, not on it, near it. We found her where the wash bends under the dead cottonwoods. I have seen bad things. I have pulled cattle out of bogs and men out from under wagons, and I dug 2 graves with my own hands the winter the fever took my family. But I want to tell you about how she was lying, because I've never forgotten it and I don't intend to. She was on her side in the sand at the bottom of the arroyo, curled around herself the way you curl around a hurt to keep it warm, and one arm was flung out toward the direction of my house, toward where she'd sent her boy. That's the thing. Even down there, even mostly gone with cold, her body was pointed the way she'd sent him. Like she'd been reaching after him the whole time he was gone. Like she'd lain there in the dark doing the only thing she could do, which was point herself at the small chance she'd bought with the last of her strength, and hold still and hope. Her leg was the trouble. Even by lantern light I could see it was broke bad, below the knee, the wrong shape under the buckskin, and the swelling had gone up past her boot top. She'd been walking on it or dragging on it, and there was a long time she'd been out here, and the cold had gotten into her the way it gets into you at the end, which is to say it had started to feel warm to her. Her eyes were half open. When the lantern hit her face, she made a sound, and the boy dropped down beside her and put his forehead against her forehead and said something low in their own tongue, over and over, and I understood not one word of it and all of it at the same time. "All right," I said to them, to myself, to Ruth maybe. "All right, all right." I have thought 100 times about the arithmetic of that moment, because I am a man who counts, and the numbers were bad. A quarter-mile back to the house, uphill, carrying a grown woman with a shattered leg in the dark, with a boy too spent to help and a cold that meant business. If I did it wrong, I'd kill her faster than the cold would. If I went for help, there was no help. The nearest neighbor was Cutter, and I would sooner have gone to the devil. If I waited for dawn, she'd be dead by dawn. So there wasn't really any arithmetic. There was only the one road, and it was a hard one, and I got down in the sand and started. I'll spare you most of the getting her up. It was ugly. She screamed once when I moved the leg, and then she didn't scream again, which was worse, because it meant she was saving what she had. I got her over my shoulder the way you carry a calf, and I felt every one of my 49 years in my back and my knees, and the boy went ahead with the lantern held in both hands, and I hummed. I couldn't help it. I hummed the whole way, that same broken hymn, 1 word per step to keep my feet moving. Shall we gather at the river? 20 steps, rest. She was so light. That's a thing I keep coming back to. A grown woman shouldn't be that light. Somebody hadn't been eating so her boy could. 40 steps, rest. The boy's face in the lantern light, watching me not to drop her. I counted. I got to somewhere past 400 steps and lost the count and started over, which is a thing I never do, and I think that's when I understood how scared I was because I'd lost my count. We made the house near an hour before dawn. I laid her on the floor by the stove, couldn't manage the bed, hadn't the strength left, and I built the fire up till it roared. And I got the buckskin cut away from that leg with my good knife, working slow, the boy holding the lantern so close I had to keep telling him back. And when I saw the leg proper in the light, I sat back on my heels, and I said a word my Ruth would not have cared for. It was broke in 2 places. The bone hadn't come through, thank God, or she'd have been dead already. But it was bad, and it was old. This had happened yesterday, maybe the day before, and she'd been out there in the country alone with a child and a broke leg, and she'd made it this far by pure refusal. I've set legs. Cattle, horses, once a man. I knew what had to happen, and I knew it was going to be terrible, and I knew there was nobody in the world to do it but me. I looked at the boy. He looked back with those flat, dark eyes. Only they weren't flat anymore. There was something moving in them now, and I realized it was hope, and I have never in my life been so afraid of a thing as I was of that boy's hope. I have to fix her leg, I told him slow. I made the shape of the break with my hands, then made the shape of it straight. It will hurt her bad, you understand? Bad, but then better, understand. He didn't nod. He turned and looked at his mama, and she said something to him, so faint I barely heard it was a voice at all, and whatever she said made his jaw go tight, and he turned back to me and put out both his small hands, palms up, and I understood he was asking me for something. Tools, a job, a way to not be helpless. So I gave him one. I put a folded strap of leather in his hands, and I showed him. When I say, you put this in her teeth so she doesn't bite her tongue, that's your job, big job, yes. Yes, he said. And God help me, I got my splints and my strips of sheet torn from Ruth's old linens that I'd never had the heart to burn. And I set my hands on that broken leg, and I looked at the woman I'd carried a quarter mile through the cold, this stranger, this mother, whose name I did not even know yet. I'm sorry, I told her. I'm sorry on 3. I always count. 1, 2. She didn't scream on 3. I'll start there because it's the thing I remember when I remember her at all. I pulled that leg straight, a long, grinding, awful pull, the kind you feel in your own bones, and she took the leather in her teeth and she made a sound down in her chest like something tearing loose. But she did not scream and she did not faint, and her eyes stayed open and fixed on the ceiling the whole time, and there were tears running sideways off her face into her hair, and she took it. She just took it. I have known strong men who couldn't have. When it was done and splinted and bound, and she'd gone slack and gray, and finally, mercifully, into a sleep that wasn't quite fainting and wasn't quite rest, the boy was still holding the other end of the leather strap in both fists like it was the only thing keeping him tied to the earth. I had to pry it out of his hands. His knuckles had gone white around it. Good, I told him. Good job, best job, sit, warm. He sat, he would not lie down. He put his back against the wall where he could see both his mama and the door, and he watched. And somewhere in the small hours he fell asleep sitting up like that, chin dropping, jerking awake, dropping again, and each time he came awake he found his mama with his eyes first and the door second, and only then let himself go back under. 8 years old, guarding a room. I sat up the rest of that night in Ruth's rocker with the rifle across my knees, and I watched the two of them, and I did not sleep at all, and I was not sorry to lose the sleep. Her name was Dotest, or near to it. She told me 3 times over the days after, and I never got my white mouth around it right, and she'd huff a little breath through her nose each time I mangled it, which I came to understand was as close as she came to laughing. The boy was Toch. That much I could say, and I said it a great deal, because a man does better with a scared child if he uses the name. Here is what I pieced together over the slow first week, out of her few hard-won English words and Toch's more and my own guessing. They were running, not raiding, not scouting, running. There'd been trouble to the south, soldiers and worse, and the two of them had gotten separated from their people in the confusion of a bad night, and they'd been alone in the country for the better part of 2 weeks trying to work north to where their band had scattered. She'd gone down a bank in the dark and broke her leg 3 days before Toch ever knocked on my door. 3 days she'd kept them alive, dragging, resting, sending the boy to snare what he could. And when she couldn't go on, she hadn't laid down to die. She'd looked at the far-off light of my window across the flat, the one light in all that black country, and she'd made a calculation no mother should ever have to make. She'd sent her only child to knock on a white man's door in a season when white men were killing her people, because the certain death of the cold was worse than the chance of me. She'd bet her boy on my mercy, a stranger she'd never seen, on the 1 in 10 chance I'd be a decent man. I think about that bet more than I think about almost anything. I think about lying in the sand with your leg in pieces, weighing your child's life against the character of a lit window and choosing to gamble. And I think about how close I came with my hand on that bolt, counting to 11 to being the wrong answer. 11. It shames me still. The trouble, of course, was the rest of the world. You can hide a great deal on 100 acres, but you cannot hide everything, and I had made a habit for 3 years of being a man nobody visited, which meant that any visitor at all was a danger now. I moved them out of the main room. There's a back room I'd shut up after that I hadn't opened in 3 years, and I opened it now and aired it and moved them into it. And if my throat closed doing it, that was my business. Toch found the small carved horse on the windowsill within the hour. It had been my son's. I watched the boy pick it up and turn it over, and I opened my mouth to tell him put that down, and I didn't. I let him have it. Some things you have to let a child have. The reckoning came 11 days in, and it came, as I'd feared, in the shape of Cutter. He rode up mid-morning with 2 of his Bardee men on the pretext of missing stock, which was a lie, and we both knew it. Cutter didn't ride social, and he didn't ride friendly, he rode to look. There'd been talk in town, he said, leaning on his saddle horn, spitting. Talk of sign cut heading north across the flats. A pash loose. A man ought to know, he said, if there was danger neighboring him. He said the word neighboring like it tasted bad. And behind me, through the wall in the back room, was a woman who could not walk and a boy who could not run. I want to tell you I faced him down clever and cool. The truth is I lied badly and my heart near come out my mouth. I said I'd seen no sign. I said my dog would have told me. I said a great many things while Cutter's flat, pale eyes went over my yard, my barn, my shut-up house. And I hummed, God help me. I started to hum, that hymn, low, and I had to stop myself with a cough because a humming man looks like a man with something to hide. He knew, I'm near sure he knew or half knew or smelled it on me. But he didn't have proof and he didn't want a shooting he couldn't explain, not yet. And so he sat there a long, long minute letting me know he knew, and then he touched his hat in a way that was an insult and said, You let us know, Silas. You let us know if you see anything you ought to. And he rode off slow, looking back twice. I stood in the yard till they were gone off the flat entire. Then I went in and I was shaking and Dotest was up on one elbow in the back room with my son's carving knife in her hand. She dragged herself to where she could reach it, broke leg and all, ready to do the only thing she'd have been able to do, and Tachai was pressed into the corner behind her with his eyes huge, and I understood that they'd heard every word, and that they'd been getting ready to die. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Dotest set the knife down slow on the floorboards, and she looked at me, and she said one of the few full English sentences I ever heard her say, and she'd clearly been saving it, turning it over, getting it right the way Tachai had gotten his 4 words right that first night. You should have said no, she said. It is safer to say no. She wasn't thanking me, that's the part that landed. She wasn't grateful, or she was, but that's not what she was doing. She was telling me the cost. She was making sure I understood plain what I'd taken on, that I'd chosen the harder and more dangerous road and that she saw it clear even if I hadn't, and that from here it only got worse, not better. She was giving me one last chance to be a smaller, safer man. To say no now, put them out, save myself. And I looked at the knife on the floor and the boy in the corner, and the woman who'd bet her son's life on my window. And I heard my dead wife go still and look at me. And I made the second choice of that whole business, the one that I knew even as I made it would cost me more than the first. No, I said. I don't reckon I should have. Then I went and started figuring how to get them north. Because that was the thing I hadn't wanted to think about and now had to. They couldn't stay. Cutter would come back and the next time he'd bring more than talk. And even if he didn't, even if by some grace we were left alone, these two weren't mine to keep. She had a people. Tachai had a people. That boy belonged out there under the sky with his own, not shut in a back room learning to be quiet, playing with a dead child's horse. Keeping them would have been the selfish thing dressed up as the kind one. I knew that. Knowing it didn't make it easier. I'd had a family in this house once and lost it. And now here was a woman and a boy filling up the empty rooms. And every part of me that had been 3 years alone wanted to shut the door and pretend the world outside had stopped. But wanting a thing has never once made it right. So over the next weeks, while that leg knit, and it knit, slow and crooked, but it knit, she'd walk again, though she'd walk with a hitch the rest of her days. I did 2 things at once, and they pulled against each other, and both of them broke my heart a little. I taught myself to let them go before they were gone. And I taught that boy everything I could think to teach him, fast, everything a body might need. How to read weather, how to find water, how to move quiet, how to snare and how to hide. My 49 years poured into 8-year-old ears in whatever time we had, because the country north of here was hard and I could not go with them. And the only thing I could send along was what was in my head. Tachai took to it like he'd been starving for it. And somewhere in the teaching I stopped counting the days I had left with them, which was a mistake. Because when a man stops counting, he forgets the number is running down. It ran down faster than I figured. Because one gray morning near the end of that second month, my dog started barking at first light and didn't stop. And I came out to the yard with the rifle and saw riders on the flat. Not Cutter this time, more than Cutter. A whole line of them coming on at a trot with the early sun behind them so I couldn't count the guns. And I turned to send Tachai to the back room to hide, to be quiet, the way we'd drilled it. And the boy wasn't looking at the riders at all. He was looking north, out past the barn to the low hills. And standing up there against the pale morning, still as the rocks, were 3 figures on foot with the dawn coming up gold behind them, and one of them raised a hand. I have started this last part a dozen times and torn up every one, because there is no clean way to tell it, and the man I've become on account of that morning does not believe in clean tellings anymore. So I'll just tell it crooked and true, the way the leg healed. 2 things were coming at us at once from opposite directions, and my whole life for the next hour was the space between them. To the south, the riders, I could see now it was Cutter and near a dozen men, come at last with their proof or come to make some. To the north, up in the hills, Dotest's people, her band. 3 of them come down out of the high country to find the ones they'd lost, working south the same way she'd been working north. And by some grace or cruelty, the 2 lines had crossed right here, right now, right on top of my little ranch on the worst possible morning. Dotest came out of the house. She shouldn't have, she could barely stand. She had a stick I'd cut her and a hitch in her step that would never leave. But she came out into the yard on her own 2 feet, and she stood there in the gray light looking north at her people. And I watched something come into her face that I'd not seen the whole 2 months. It wasn't quite joy. It was too big and too broke for joy. It was the look of a person seeing the thing they'd stopped letting themselves want. And then she looked south at the riders and did the arithmetic, same as I had done in the Arroyo 2 months before. The hills were maybe a half mile. Cutter was less and mounted. She could not run, not with that leg, not fast enough. There was no version of that morning where a woman with a hitch outran a dozen horses to the hills. But the boy could. You see it coming, I expect. I saw it coming, and I have never in my life wanted so badly to be wrong about a thing. She got down on her bad leg in the dirt of my yard, so she was eye to eye with Toch, and she took his face in both her hands, and she talked to him low and fast in their own tongue, and he was shaking his head, no, no, the way any child would, no, I won't leave you. And she kept on. And I stood there holding a rifle I didn't dare raise, useless, an old man watching a mother send her son away for the 2nd time in 2 months to save his life. Only this time she wasn't sending him toward a stranger's window. She was sending him toward his own people and away from her, because she could not run and he could, and if he waited for her they'd both be taken, and if he ran, one of them would live. Collective action, some folks call it. Sacrifice. Big cold words for what it actually is, which is a woman kneeling in the dirt with a broke leg telling her baby to run and not look back while the horses come. Toch turned to me. I want to be careful here, because this is the part that matters, and I've never once told it right. He turned to me, this boy I'd taught to read the weather and snare a rabbit and move quiet, this boy who slept sitting up guarding a room, who'd knocked on my door in the dark and said Mama needs help. He turned to me with his mama's hands still on his face, and he wasn't asking me to save her. He was old enough and had seen enough to know I couldn't. He was asking me something harder. He was asking me to take her place. Not in words. There wasn't time for words, and he didn't have the words anyhow. But a look can be a whole sentence when it has to be, and the sentence in that look was, if I run now, I leave her. Unless you're here, unless you'll stay with her. Unless the promise I can't keep, you'll keep. And I nodded. God forgive me or God bless me, I've never been sure which. I nodded. I said, go, I've got her. Go, Toch, run, I've got her. And I put my hand on Dotest's shoulder to prove it, to show him, this stranger's hand on his mother's shoulder standing between her and the guns, and it was the truest promise I ever made, and I made it to a child in the space of one breath. He ran. He ran north with everything I'd taught him, and everything he already was, low and fast and cutting the ground the way I'd shown him. And he did not look back. She told him not to, and he didn't. He ran clean up into the hills toward the raised hand and the golden light, and the 3 figures came down to meet him, and one of them scooped him up without breaking stride. And they went up over the ridge and were gone into the high country, and the whole of it took less than 2 minutes, and it was the longest 2 minutes of my life. Cutter reined up in my yard in a cloud of dust and cursing. I won't give you all of it, you can guess most. There was a woman there he could see plain, an Apache woman, in the yard of a man who'd sworn he'd seen no sign, and that was proof enough for Cutter's purposes. And for a bad long while I stood between a dozen mounted men and a woman leaning on a stick, and I truly believed I was about to die, and worse, that she was. What saved us, and I've turned this over 10,000 times, was the plainest, smallest thing. It was that I did not let go of her shoulder. I stood there with my hand on her shoulder and my old rifle pointed at the ground, and I looked up at Cutter, and I did not hum, and I did not count, and I did not lie anymore. I told him the truth. I told him she'd come to my door near dead with a broke leg and a child, and that I'd taken her in and set the leg and kept her, and that I'd do it again, and that if he wanted to hang a man for pulling a hurt woman out of a ditch, then he'd best get his rope, but he'd do it in front of his men in the full light of morning with nothing to hide behind, and every one of them would have to carry it after. I've never known what did it. Maybe there was one man in that dozen with a mother of his own. Maybe Cutter, for all he was, didn't have the belly to shoot an unarmed woman and an old fool in cold blood with the sun up and his own men watching to see what kind of thing he was. Maybe he just weighed the trouble against the satisfaction and found the trouble heavier. He sat his horse a long time, longer than that first day. And then he leaned over and spat, close to my boot, and he said something I won't repeat about what I was and what she was, and he wheeled his horse and took his men and rode off south, and he never once looked back either, and I have not spoken to him from that day to this. Dot's people did not come down. They watched from the ridge till the riders were gone, and then they were gone too, north with the boy to the high country where I could not follow and had no business following. That was right. I knew it was right. It didn't feel like anything I'd call right, standing in my empty yard with the dust settling. But I'd learned by then the difference between what's right and what feels good, and how seldom they're the same animal. She stayed 4 more days. The leg wasn't fit for the hills yet, and we both knew she'd have to make it eventually, and there was a strange, gentle time in those 4 days, the 2 of us and no boy, an old widower and a woman who'd walk with a hitch forever, not talking much, not needing to. On the last morning she was strong enough. Her people had left sign for her, a way to follow. She stood in my yard with a stick I'd cut her and a pack I'd filled heavier than she wanted to carry, and we looked at each other, and there was too much to say and no shared words to say it in, so we didn't try. She reached out and she pressed something into my hand and closed my fingers over it. It was the small carved horse, my son's. She'd taken it from the windowsill for Toch, I thought at first, and my heart cracked that she'd give it back. But then I understood she wasn't giving it back. She was telling me she'd seen it. She'd seen whose it was and what the empty rooms meant and the graves under the cottonwood. She'd seen the whole shape of my 3 years alone, and this was her saying she knew. That she'd known all along what it cost a broke man to open a door. That was her thank you, the one she'd been too honest to say out loud 2 months before. She said my name, got it right, the way I never got hers, and then she said, in that careful saved-up English, the last thing she ever said to me. Toch will remember, she said. When he is a man, he will tell it, the old one who did not say no. Then she turned and walked north with her hitching step, up toward the hills, and I stood in my yard, and I did not hum, and I did not count, and I watched her go small against the country until she went over the ridge and was gone. I never saw either of them again. But I'll tell you a thing, and then I'll stop, because there's a place a story ought to end, and this is near it. Some years on, I was an old man proper by then, more years behind than ahead. A young Apache man came through this country, passing north, and he did not stop at my place, but he sat his horse a long while out on the flat, up on the low hills, right about where 3 figures once stood against the dawn. He sat there and he looked down at my ranch a good long time.